Ryan Miller had never been the kind of man drawn to conflict. His life revolved around structure, craftsmanship, and patience, the things he could build, fix, and understand. After 2 decades working in residential construction and custom renovations, he had developed a quiet confidence, the kind that comes not from shouting to be heard but from doing the work and letting the results speak for themselves. His hands were calloused, his back ached most mornings, and he had long since traded impulsive ambition for a deeply held appreciation of peace. That was what he and his wife, Laura, had been chasing when they moved into their new home at the far edge of a private community tucked into the outskirts of North Carolina pine country. Laura was a retired Army communications technician, discharged after suffering neurological trauma from a roadside incident overseas. The injury hadn't left her visibly broken. No wheelchair, no cane, but she lived with partial sensory loss on her left side and a persistent hand tremor that made even simple tasks like holding a coffee mug or buttoning a shirt into a test of patience. But it wasn't just the physical limitations. The weight she carried was quieter, harder to spot. The daily mental calibration, the need to constantly read the room, judge distance, scan for judgment. Too many people saw her and assumed she was faking, or worse, ungrateful. Even in veteran support groups, she'd had to defend her diagnosis. The new house was supposed to be a reset, a place where that didn't matter. The 2-story colonial they purchased was modest but solid, a product of the post-recession housing boom, nestled against a tree line that cut off abruptly into undeveloped woods. The area was known for its tight restrictions, manicured lawns, and overregulated aesthetics, but Ryan had reviewed the bylaws carefully. More importantly, Laura's VA program granted her a permanent exemption from all residential association dues and committee participation. Everything about their move had been methodical and legal. They weren't trying to challenge anything or draw attention. They just wanted a safe, quiet space with a garden and a back porch where Laura could drink tea and not feel watched. The first few weeks were blissfully uneventful. Ryan set up his tools in the garage, built raised planters for Laura, and spent evenings sealing the deck with an oil he swore by. They greeted a few neighbors, waved at passing cars, and kept mostly to themselves. Their property, set slightly back from the curb, was surrounded on 2 sides by low-maintenance shrubs and a split-rail fence Ryan had reinforced with pressure-treated beams. The mailbox, black and standard, sat precisely where it was supposed to, 8 inches from the curb. Every detail, every dimension was by the book. Which is why, on a pale gray Thursday morning, when Laura returned from a slow walk around the back perimeter of the property to find a stranger standing at the end of their driveway, clipboard in hand and eyes fixed on her, something felt immediately off. The man wasn't dressed like a delivery person or a maintenance worker. No badge, no company logo, just pressed khakis, a short-sleeved collared shirt, and a plastic ID card hanging from a retractable clip that bounced with each subtle motion. He didn't smile or wave. He didn't ask her name. Instead, in a tone that managed to be both casual and quietly condescending, he asked, "Do you live here?" Laura, caught off guard, nodded, hesitant. "Yes. Can I help you?" "You're walking in a restricted zone. This is part of the easement maintained by the community council." Laura blinked. "This is our property line. My husband measured it himself." The man didn't respond, at least not right away. He looked down at his clipboard, clicked something on the side of his pen, and then glanced back up. "You're not permitted to be in this area without proper identification or authorization." "I live here," she repeated, firmer now. "And I don't need to carry ID to walk in my backyard." Something about the way he looked at her made her stomach tighten. Not aggressive exactly, but predatory in a bureaucratic way. The kind of expression that suggests the outcome has already been decided, and everything else is just ritual. The man reached for his belt, fingers grazing something clipped beside what looked like a small utility pouch. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back toward the front sidewalk while we resolve this." Laura, confused but growing uneasy, took one step backward but kept her eyes on him. "What are you doing?" "I'm issuing a compliance warning." That was the last thing she heard before the click of the taser firing broke the air like a gunshot. A crackling burst of electricity followed, and Laura crumpled to the ground, her left side seizing up violently, her mouth opening in a wordless cry. The man said nothing. He didn't check on her, didn't even approach. He simply retracted the taser prongs with a mechanical tug and stood still, clipboard now pressed to his chest as if nothing at all had happened. Ryan had been in the kitchen pouring a second cup of coffee when he saw her collapse through the bay window. His mug shattered against the sink. By the time he got outside, she was curled on the pavement, struggling to breathe, one hand pressed awkwardly to her chest, the other twitching in the grass. The man was still standing there, expression unreadable. "What the fuck did you do?" Ryan shouted, sprinting down the porch steps. "She was non-compliant." "She's my wife." The man didn't flinch. She crossed into a designated control zone and refused directive withdrawal. "You tased her for walking near a goddamn fence." Ryan knelt beside Laura, checking her pulse, looking for burns, trying not to panic. She was conscious but barely able to speak. Her eyes were wide with confusion and pain. Ryan didn't wait. He pulled out his phone, called 911, and when they asked if the attacker was armed, he said yes, because no one casually carrying a taser and quoting legal directives on private property should be treated as anything less. The police arrived 12 minutes later. Paramedics pulled up seconds after. Laura was lifted into the ambulance on a gurney, an oxygen mask pressed over her mouth. The man who had tased her calmly presented his ID to the responding officers, spoke in calm, practiced language, and referred to community enforcement codes and non-standard property perimeter ambiguity. The words meant nothing to Ryan, but he saw the effect they had. Officers nodded, wrote things down, asked Ryan to calm down. He didn't calm down. In fact, as Laura was driven away in the ambulance and the officers finished jotting down his statement without so much as handcuffing the man who had assaulted her, Ryan felt something shift inside him, a switch flipping, a coldness settling into his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with injustice. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a bad apple or a rogue enforcer. This was a system, quiet, smug, and protected, that had just declared war on his family. And he wasn't going to let it happen again. The hours that followed blurred together in Ryan's mind, a nauseating carousel of paperwork, hospital hallways, and carefully worded statements that felt more like warnings than conversations. Laura was admitted for observation under neurological trauma protocols, the emergency room physician noting that the electrical discharge had aggravated her existing nerve damage. Her left arm, already weakened from her previous injuries, now barely responded to stimuli, and her speech, usually clear though measured, became slow and halting. The attending physician delicately advised that further tests would be needed to rule out long-term worsening of her symptoms. But even if recovery was possible, the attack had caused real damage. Ryan held her hand through it all, feeling the fine tremors in her fingers, the quiet frustration that radiated from her even when she said nothing. When the police finally returned to take his full statement, they seemed almost reluctant. The officer leading the report, a trim man with thinning blonde hair named Officer Peters, spent more time explaining the enforcement contracts signed by the community council than he did asking about the assault itself. According to him, the man who had tased Laura was an external compliance consultant authorized by the council's extended safety program. A program, Peters was careful to emphasize, that Ryan and Laura had agreed to by purchasing a home within the boundaries of the neighborhood. Ryan listened in stunned disbelief as the officer spoke, each word sounding more absurd than the last. He had never agreed to armed consultants patrolling his property line, nor to a system where someone could be electrocuted for stepping a few feet beyond an imaginary easement. After Peters left, mumbling something about letting the lawyers figure it out, Ryan sat in the stiff plastic hospital chair next to Laura's bed and let his fury cool into something harder, sharper. Rage would accomplish nothing. Panic would make him reckless. What he needed was precision. He pulled out his phone and began documenting everything. Times, names, badge numbers, the exact phrasing used in every conversation. When the hospital's night nurse came in to check Laura's vitals, Ryan asked for a full copy of the admittance paperwork, knowing the importance of securing medical documentation immediately before revisions or bureaucratic revisions could muddy the record. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The next morning, he contacted an attorney. He didn't go cheap. Instead, he found a firm that specialized in civil rights and property law, a firm known for aggressive litigation against municipalities and corporate entities. Within 2 hours, he had an initial consultation scheduled, and within 4, he was emailing them scanned copies of every document he had managed to gather so far. The reply came back almost immediately, concise and grim. Retain all medical records, take dated photographs of Laura's injuries, do not engage with the community council without legal representation, and prepare for aggressive counter-actions. The warning proved prescient. Before Ryan and Laura had even returned home, a formal letter awaited them taped to their front door, printed on heavy letterhead bearing the insignia of the Community Council's Security Oversight Division. It was a notice of incident and remedial action, accusing Laura of willful noncompliance with posted directives, aggravated resistance to enforcement personnel, and unauthorized access to easement-maintained property. The letter concluded by informing them that, pending a review by the Council's Adjudication Board, their residential privileges could be suspended, including access to shared amenities, curbside services, and, disturbingly, emergency response integration. Ryan stood on the porch reading the letter twice in disbelief before balling it up and tossing it into the trash. Suspended emergency response? That wasn't just absurd. It was illegal. They couldn't selectively withhold life-saving services based on a petty property dispute, no matter what internal rules they invented. But it was a warning shot across the bow, a message that the community council had no intention of admitting wrongdoing. Instead, they were digging in, painting Laura not as a victim but as an aggressor, hoping to intimidate the Millers into silence or, better yet, departure. Inside the house, Laura moved gingerly from room to room, refusing help but clearly struggling. Ryan didn't push her. He knew how fiercely she guarded her independence, how much she hated being treated like she was fragile. Still, he stayed close, quietly adjusting anything she might need without making a production of it, lowering the kettle onto the counter, moving the heavier coffee mugs to a lower shelf, propping the sliding door open so she wouldn't have to wrestle with it. Small things, invisible supports. That night, after Laura had finally fallen into an uneasy sleep on the couch, Ryan sat alone in the living room, a notebook balanced on his knee. He began making a list. Names, dates, actions taken. He mapped out everything they had done so far and tried to anticipate what the council might do next. If they were willing to taser a veteran in broad daylight and then accuse her of wrongdoing, what else would they stoop to? The next day, Ryan's attorney filed the initial notification of pending litigation with the council's legal office. It was a procedural first step, but an important one. It froze certain actions the council might otherwise have taken, like unilaterally fining them or attempting to escalate enforcement without judicial oversight. It also made them aware that Ryan and Laura weren't going to roll over quietly. But retaliation came swiftly. A courier delivered a notice from the local zoning office, claiming that their fence violated newly updated boundary setback requirements and demanding immediate removal pending a compliance inspection. Ryan knew the fence met all original codes. He had measured and double-checked everything himself during installation. The so-called update was dated 2 weeks after they had moved in, an obvious retroactive attempt to harass them into compliance through administrative bullying. Rather than reacting emotionally, Ryan documented everything, photographing the fence from multiple angles, pulling the original zoning certificates he had meticulously saved, and forwarding the entire packet to his attorney. He didn't so much as remove a single board. The message was clear. If the council wanted a fight, they were going to get one, but it would be fought on legal terms, not their battlefield of intimidation and manufactured technicalities. Meanwhile, neighbors who had once waved now seemed to avoid eye contact. A few even crossed the street rather than walk past the Miller's driveway. Someone dumped a bag of rotting yard waste against their back fence during the night, and Ryan found small gouges scratched into his truck's driver's side door the next morning. He knew better than to react publicly. That was exactly what the council wanted, to provoke an outburst, a scene they could record and weaponize. Instead, he installed a discreet, high-resolution security system around the property, making sure every inch was covered and documented every incident in a dedicated file. Through it all, Laura remained outwardly stoic, but Ryan could see the cracks forming. Her tremors worsened under stress. She stopped venturing outside except to walk to the mailbox, and even that she did quickly, eyes darting to every parked car or distant figure. She didn't talk much about the incident. When she did, it was only in clipped, minimal phrases, as if describing someone else's injury, not her own. Ryan knew better than to push her to open up. He focused on action, on building the kind of defense that would allow her to reclaim not just her home, but her dignity. Every evening, as they sat quietly together, Ryan reviewed case law, council charters, state property codes, anything that might give them an edge. He filed federal disability discrimination complaints, cited veteran protection acts, and reached out to advocacy groups who specialized in representing military families targeted by predatory neighborhood associations. Each step was slow, deliberate, and methodical. The council likely thought they were grinding Ryan down, but in truth, they were sharpening him. What they had mistaken for resignation was simply patience. The patience of a man who understood that some things couldn't be rushed if you wanted them to last. And Ryan intended to make their victory permanent. 3 days after Laura returned home from the hospital, the neighborhood changed. It wasn't in any overt way, not at first. There were no direct threats, no mobs or confrontations. The shift was quieter, colder. Neighbors who had once nodded politely as they passed now averted their gaze, some turning their heads entirely as if the mere act of acknowledging Ryan and Laura might drag them into something unseemly. Others lingered near their windows when Laura stepped outside, their expressions carefully blank, yet somehow watchful. There were no more shared smiles at the mailbox, no more casual greetings in the street. The silence pressed in like fog, subtle but stifling. Ryan recognized it for what it was, calculated isolation. It wasn't just social, either. Subtle but deliberate pressure began to manifest in other ways. A low, rhythmic thump sounded behind their fence each morning just before dawn, as if someone were striking the panels with a hammer wrapped in cloth. Small piles of gravel appeared across their driveway, forcing Ryan to sweep the entrance clear before he could reverse his truck out for work. Twice, the irrigation system in their front yard mysteriously shorted out, flooding the lawn and drowning the rose bushes Laura had painstakingly planted only weeks before the incident. It could all be dismissed as coincidence. That was the point. It was the kind of psychological warfare that never gave you enough evidence to accuse someone directly, but just enough disruption to keep you on edge. Ryan responded the only way he knew how, by documenting everything, methodically and with precision. Every morning, he walked the perimeter of their property with a digital voice recorder in his pocket, narrating timestamps, observations, and changes. He installed more cameras, some obvious, some discreet, and programmed them to upload footage to an encrypted cloud drive every hour. He photographed the gravel, the broken sprinkler heads, the scratched window screens, and logged every date and detail in a private file he backed up nightly. His attorney told him he was doing the right thing. That kind of evidence didn't just help in court. It often stopped escalation when the opposing side realized how thorough you were. But this time, the intimidation didn't stop. It evolved. A letter arrived from the County Planning and Zoning Department, citing a violation of vegetative boundaries due to what it called unauthorized encroachment of plant life across a shared right-of-way. Ryan stared at the notice, baffled, then furious. They were referencing a wisteria vine that hung over their side gate, a plant Laura had trained for months to grow along the trellis for shade and privacy. According to the letter, he had 14 days to remove the offending vegetation or face fines of up to $1,500. It was bureaucratic madness, but more than that, it was harassment through institutional proxies. Ryan filed a formal appeal, knowing it would buy them time, but the message was clear. This wasn't going to end quietly. Later that same week, while Laura was in the kitchen peeling potatoes with a visible tremor in her left hand, Ryan heard a sharp knock at the door. He opened it to find 3 individuals standing on the porch. All wore crisp polo shirts with a stylized leaf emblem over the chest pocket, representatives of the Community Council's Compliance Assessment Committee. The tallest among them, a man with an artificial tan and a clipboard gripped like a weapon, introduced himself as Wesley Gant, Liaison for Structural Alignment Matters. He offered no handshake. "We're here to conduct a scheduled property evaluation regarding recent inconsistencies between recorded survey data and observed perimeter indicators," he said without inflection. "We didn't schedule anything," Ryan replied flatly. "It's part of a rotating oversight cycle. You're within the compliance window," Gant explained as though that clarified anything. Ryan crossed his arms. "You'll need to reschedule through our legal representation." "That's not necessary," Gant said, already stepping off the porch toward the side gate. Ryan didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply moved to block the path. "This is private property. You're not stepping 1 foot past that fence without a court order." For a long second, no one moved. Gant's eyes narrowed, calculating. Then he nodded once as if ticking off a box on an internal checklist. Without another word, the 3 representatives turned and walked back to their vehicle, a black SUV parked a few feet from the curb with no plates. Ryan watched them go, his jaw tight, the heat rising in his neck. He knew what this was. It was a test, and his refusal to yield meant escalation. 2 nights later, Ryan was reviewing camera footage on his laptop when a flicker of motion caught his attention. It was just past midnight. The timestamp showed 12:18 a.m. On screen, a figure appeared near the back fence, just for a moment barely more than a silhouette, then another. They didn't climb the fence or break it. They stood just beyond it, their faces masked by night, holding something between them. A box or a bundle, it wasn't clear. The camera wasn't close enough to catch details, but the implication was unmistakable. Ryan checked the other feeds. Nothing showed anyone entering the property, but near the front gate another camera had picked up the soft chime of a motion sensor being tripped, then immediately disabled. Ryan didn't sleep that night. He walked the property line with a flashlight, boots crunching over damp grass, and found the grass trampled near the southeast corner where the fence met the drainage ditch. The fence itself had been disturbed. One of the nails looked freshly pulled, and the gate latch bore tiny scratches, as though someone had tried to test the lock. Not break it, just test it. He reported the incident to local law enforcement in the morning, knowing full well what kind of response he'd receive. Predictably, the officer who took his statement, another polite but ultimately disengaged face, scribbled notes, nodded, and promised to submit a report for review. No patrols. No follow-up. Nothing would happen unless someone was injured, or unless a weapon was discharged. It wasn't negligence. It was protocol. And that was what made it so dangerous. The next development arrived in the form of a certified letter from the neighborhood's Insurance Risk Mitigation Board, a body Ryan hadn't even known existed until that day. The letter advised that due to unresolved behavioral irregularities, the Millers' property had been flagged for elevated liability risk, and their previously issued safety compliance certification had been suspended. Effective immediately, their residents would be excluded from neighborhood-maintained emergency utility prioritization during storms, blackouts, or other natural disruptions. The letter ended with a perfunctory, "Thank you for your attention," as though it were a routine memo and not a bureaucratic death sentence. Ryan's lawyer exploded when he sent her the scan. "They're creating a paper trail to make you look like a threat," she warned. "They're positioning you as the disruption. So when they finally make a move to push you out, it'll look justified on paper." The implication hit harder than anything yet. It wasn't about the taser anymore. It wasn't about Laura, or even Ryan's refusal to be intimidated. This was systemic, methodical, an institution with rules built not to protect, but to suffocate, to marginalize anyone who didn't bend. They were being maneuvered, methodically pushed toward either surrender or self-destruction. And Ryan knew which one they were counting on. The escalation had pushed Ryan and Laura into a corner, but it had also clarified one crucial fact. This was no longer simply about retaliation or pettiness. It was a campaign, organized, coordinated, and blessed by the very institutions meant to maintain fairness in their community. Ryan realized that fighting back with isolated complaints and appeals would be like throwing stones at a machine designed to grind people down through attrition. He needed leverage, real leverage, something that could not be explained away by polite letters or buried in procedural red tape. It wasn't enough to know they were being targeted. He had to prove it with mechanisms larger than the ones being weaponized against them. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Their attorney, a tough, sharp-tongued woman named Alicia Warren, discovered a quiet, overlooked clause tucked deep in the federal statutes that governed military veteran property protections. According to a rarely invoked provision of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, any property bought by a qualified veteran through certain VA-backed loan programs received a federal overlay of rights that superseded local governance, agreements, including the ability to bypass arbitrary zoning enforcement and override association sanctions if those sanctions discriminated on the basis of veteran status or disability. Armed with this knowledge, Alicia submitted a formal petition to the Department of Veterans Affairs, requesting federal review of the Community Council's actions. But she didn't stop there. She filed a temporary restraining order against the neighborhood's administrative board, citing pattern harassment under federally protected status. It was a risky move. It would raise the temperature immediately, but it was the first meaningful escalation they had launched, and it felt right. The reaction was instantaneous. Ryan received a visit not from compliance officers or clipboard-carrying bureaucrats, but from a man who introduced himself as Charles Benton, special counsel to the Community Oversight Partnership. Dressed in a tailored gray suit, Benton exuded the smooth calm of someone who lived in courtrooms and boardrooms, not streets or front yards. He didn't bluster or threaten. Instead, he spoke in a careful, almost paternal tone as he explained that both parties would benefit from de-escalating hostilities and finding mutually agreeable compromises before irreparable community divisions occurred. Ryan listened politely. He made no promises. Benton smiled like a man who expected that reaction and slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a draft settlement agreement, offering to buy out Ryan and Laura's home for 10% above their original purchase price, if they vacated within 30 days and signed a non-disclosure agreement. Ryan barely restrained the impulse to laugh in the man's face. They weren't just trying to drive him out anymore. They were trying to erase them, bury the entire incident under a mountain of polite legal language and make sure no one ever knew how far things had gone. When Benton left, Ryan burned the settlement draft in the backyard fire pit. It wasn't a grand gesture, and there was no one there to see it but Laura, who stood beside him silently, arms crossed tightly against her chest. But it felt necessary. A physical repudiation of the idea that they were disposable, that they could be bought out of their own lives. That night they agreed on a new approach. No more isolated responses. No more defensive positioning. Ryan reached out to veterans organizations, advocacy groups specializing in disability rights, and contacts he still had through old construction union networks. He didn't tell them every detail. He didn't need to. All he had to say was that a decorated disabled veteran was being systemically harassed by a private administrative body, and doors began to open. Attorneys called back. Policy specialists offered advice. One group even assigned a volunteer investigator to quietly begin compiling a dossier on the council's financial practices, particularly the sudden creation of new infrastructure improvement funds and risk mitigation fees that seemed to disproportionately target newer, less connected residents. Meanwhile, Laura started her own form of resistance. She refused to hide anymore. She went back to tending her garden, planting new seedlings even as disapproving faces peeked from behind blinds. She walked the perimeter twice a day, head held high, without apology. If someone wanted to call security on her for breathing the wrong way, let them. She carried copies of the VA protective clauses with her in a laminated pouch around her neck like an ID badge, not because she needed permission, but to remind anyone watching that she was no longer playing their game. Predictably, the council pushed back harder. New citations appeared like clockwork: excessive runoff from garden hoses, unauthorized lawn ornamentation, failure to submit seasonal maintenance reports. Ryan saved them all, piling the absurdity into a single, growing file. When Alicia saw it, she laughed without humor. "They're digging their own grave," she said, "and we're going to be the ones handing them the shovel." The real breakthrough came when the volunteer investigator turned up a critical piece of evidence. Internal emails leaked from a mid-level administrator on the council's Financial Oversight Committee. The emails detailed discussions about how to manage high-risk acquisitions by encouraging voluntary displacements through targeted compliance actions. The language was clinical, sanitized, but the meaning was unmistakable. They were actively identifying properties tied to vulnerable populations, particularly disabled individuals and older veterans, because those properties were legally messy and harder to monetize under standard resale restrictions. Ryan and Laura weren't random victims. They were targets chosen because the system had calculated that they were the path of least resistance. Armed with this evidence, Alicia filed a formal federal discrimination complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. She also began preparing a civil lawsuit, not just against the community council but against individual members of its governing board for conspiracy to violate federal protections. It was a bold strategy, fraught with risks, but it shifted the battlefield dramatically. No longer were Ryan and Laura isolated homeowners fighting against the murky might of neighborhood politics. Now they were plaintiffs with a federal agency taking interest, and the council could feel the ground shifting beneath their feet. Ryan knew better than to celebrate early. The road ahead would be long, messy, and expensive. Victory was never guaranteed, and systems like the one aligned against them had deep resources and deeper connections. But for the first time since Laura had collapsed on the asphalt under the crackle of a taser, they weren't just surviving. They were fighting on their own terms, and they were no longer fighting alone. The months that followed became a relentless tug-of-war, each side tightening their grip with every passing week. Ryan and Laura found themselves at the center of a quiet storm, a battle that rarely made noise but rattled every corner of their lives with its persistence. The community council, smarting from the federal complaints and escalating legal scrutiny, shifted tactics. Where once they had favored subtle harassment and procedural games, now they resorted to more aggressive shows of control, actions calculated to break the Millers' patience and drain their resources without ever crossing the obvious lines of criminal behavior. It began with the utilities. First, their water pressure dropped inexplicably, barely enough to trigger a formal complaint, but enough to make daily living miserable. Showers became trickles. The garden withered from inadequate irrigation. Calls to the Municipal Services Department yielded polite apologies and vague promises of inspections that never materialized. Next, their garbage pickups began to miss their house, forcing Ryan to haul weeks' worth of trash to a remote drop-off center outside town. Then, one by one, service providers that had previously worked with them, landscapers, repairmen, even grocery delivery drivers, canceled appointments without explanation. Word, it seemed, had spread. The Millers were trouble. Better to avoid them entirely. The psychological siege didn't stop at inconvenience. Signs began appearing around the neighborhood: community pride, not problem properties, keep our streets safe, respect compliance. None of them mentioned Ryan and Laura by name, but the message was clear. Ryan saw the way passers-by glanced toward their house with sidelong suspicion, the way conversations abruptly stopped when he walked into a local coffee shop. Isolation had turned into quiet hostility. It was not just them against the council anymore. It was them against a community that had been systematically taught to see them as threats. And then came the financial attacks. Shortly after filing their discrimination complaint, Ryan and Laura received a letter from their mortgage lender, a bland, non-committal note informing them that their loan had been flagged for review under a routine reassessment of collateral conditions. A second letter, this one far less neutral, arrived days later, demanding proof that their property remained in good standing with all governing bodies and associations, or risk mandatory loan reassessment, a process that could lead to refinancing penalties or even foreclosure proceedings. It was a bureaucratic chokehold, perfectly legal and devastatingly effective. Ryan knew their property was in fine condition, but the mountain of fabricated infractions and council violations painted a very different picture on paper. The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. Even if they won every court case, even if they successfully proved harassment and discrimination, financial institutions could still act independently based on risk assessments. The council didn't have to evict them. They just had to make it impossible for them to stay. Ryan didn't crumble. He adapted. He engaged a second law firm, one specializing in real estate finance, to counter the lender's maneuvers. He pulled together affidavits, property evaluations, maintenance records, and dozens of photos to document the true condition of their home. It was tedious, mind-numbing work. Days spent hunched over a desk sorting receipts and statements, but Ryan attacked the task with a kind of grim ferocity. If they wanted to drown him in paperwork, fine. He would build a mountain higher than theirs. Laura, for her part, grew quieter. Her strength, so formidable in the early stages, began to show cracks under the unrelenting strain. She spoke less, slept poorly, and spent hours sitting on the back porch, staring into the trees beyond their fence. Ryan tried to be there for her, to give her space without letting her drift away. But the wounds cut deep, and there were some battles she had to fight alone. He understood that too well to push. The real breaking point came late one night just after 2 a.m., when Ryan was jolted awake by the blaring wail of their perimeter alarm. He grabbed the nearest flashlight and rushed downstairs, heart hammering, adrenaline sharpening every sense. Laura, pale and trembling, met him at the stairwell, her fingers clutching the railing so tightly her knuckles blanched. Together, they crept to the front window. Two figures in dark clothing were crouched near their fence line, working quickly, methodically. One held what looked like a heavy-duty bolt cutter. The other carried a roll of bright orange construction tape. Ryan recognized the tactic instantly. They were marking the property as a hazard zone, an unofficial condemnation used to signal utility crews and city workers that a property was unsafe and could be bypassed for services. It was the first step in a bureaucratic erasure, a methodical disassembly of their rights by painting their home as abandoned, dangerous, unfit for residency. Without thinking, Ryan threw open the front door and charged into the night. The figures startled, dropping their tools and sprinting toward a waiting black SUV idling without headlights at the corner. Ryan chased them halfway down the block before the vehicle peeled away, tires screeching on the asphalt. He stood, panting in the darkness, fists clenched, every fiber of his being screaming for action. But he knew better than to let rage dictate his next move. He returned to the house, called the police, and documented everything. He photographed the broken latch, the construction tape, the tire tracks in the soft dirt. When the patrol car arrived 40 minutes later, the officer was young, nervous and already half apologizing before he even stepped out of his vehicle. "Without clear video of faces or license plates, there's not much we can do," he said, avoiding Ryan's eyes. Ryan said nothing. He just handed over the documentation and added another incident report to the growing dossier he and Alicia were building. By the next morning, the construction tape had been removed, presumably by whoever had ordered it placed, but the message lingered like smoke in the air. They could be labeled, targeted, erased, all without formal declarations or open confrontation. It was a war of attrition, fought with paperwork and policy instead of bullets, but no less deadly in its intent. A week later, their mailbox was smashed to pieces, the metal bent and twisted as if struck by a bat. Ryan didn't bother reporting it. Instead, he installed a reinforced steel replacement anchored deep in concrete and wired it with a motion sensor that triggered an alarm inside the house. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was survival. The federal agencies involved in their case moved slowly, agonizingly so. Investigators requested interviews, inspected documents, asked endless rounds of questions. Progress was measured in inches, not miles. But it was progress. Alicia remained a constant force, relentless and shrewd, steering them through the legal labyrinth with a steady hand. She warned them that the council's goal now wasn't to win in court. It was to exhaust them, financially and emotionally, until retreat seemed like the only sane option. Ryan refused to give them that satisfaction. He doubled down on securing the property, reinforcing gates, adding floodlights, installing backup generators in case of power failures. He started carrying a body camera whenever he stepped outside, recording every interaction, every walk to the mailbox, every trip to the hardware store. It wasn't about fear. It was about building an unbreakable record, one they couldn't twist or bury. Through it all, he never lost sight of why they were fighting. Not for pride, not even for revenge, but because giving in would mean validating everything the council believed, that people like Laura, wounded and different, could be quietly erased if they were inconvenient enough. Ryan wouldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let their lives be reduced to a cautionary tale whispered among boardrooms and policy manuals. Their home, battered though it was by the invisible siege, still stood. And so did they. For now. It wasn't the final straw that broke Ryan. It was the timing. 3 months into their federal litigation, after countless letters, investigations, procedural obstacles, and nights of Laura waking in a sweat from the slightest noise outside, they received notice that their property had been scheduled for a compliance review audit by an independent municipal subcontractor. The audit was described as non-invasive and standard protocol, but Ryan knew better than to believe euphemisms. Attached to the notice was a map, crudely marked to show segments of their backyard, parts of the driveway, and even their porch listed as areas of concern. The language danced carefully around legality, but the implication was unmistakable. They were one step away from being declared a code violation zone, which could trigger forced relocation pending remediation. Ryan handed the notice to Alicia, who exhaled through her teeth before calling a contact she had in the department of the local oversight. The word that came back chilled them both. The audit was a formality before issuing a preliminary condemnation order. Someone on the board had fast-tracked the process using a clause buried in an old fire hazard zoning directive, one never meant to be applied to residential lots like theirs. The intent wasn't just to harass, It was to erase the Millers from the map entirely. Ryan didn't panic. He prepared. That evening, he and Laura sat at the kitchen table surrounded by documents, blueprints, inspection certifications, and legal letters. He outlined every step of their next move while she listened silently, her face a mask of stillness. When she finally spoke, it was not with hesitation or fear, but with clarity. "We're not leaving," she said, "even if they burn it to the ground." The next day, Alicia filed a cease and desist order against the board, citing abuse of process, targeting under disability law, and procedural violations tied to the audit. But it wasn't enough. That night, the audit team arrived early, far earlier than any legally allowed window. Ryan heard the hum of a vehicle engine at 5:43 a.m., followed by the crunch of heavy boots on gravel. He stepped outside to find 2 men and 1 woman standing beside a dark blue pickup marked with the logo of a private infrastructure firm contracted by the council. They carried tablets and measuring tools, and though they offered smiles, their demeanor was coldly professional. "Just following protocol," one of them said, already stepping toward the side gate. Ryan blocked their path and asked if they had a court order. They did not. They had a letter, unsigned with no agency seal, authorizing entry. Ryan informed them it wasn't valid without judicial approval. They hesitated, then retreated to their vehicle and made a call. Moments later, a squad car arrived. This time, Ryan didn't argue. He calmly explained the situation to the officer, presented the cease and desist documents, and handed over copies of the protective federal orders tied to their property. The officer, a new face, young and clearly uncomfortable, read everything carefully. Then, to Ryan's surprise, he turned to the audit team and said, "You're not authorized to proceed today." The contractors pushed back, but the officer stood firm. For the first time in months, someone on the ground had refused to be a pawn. The audit team left. Ryan stood in the driveway long after they were gone, staring at the empty road. He hadn't won, not yet, but the spell was breaking. The script they'd written for him and Laura was no longer playing out as expected. They had become unpredictable variables in a system that thrived on silence and conformity. The tipping point came a week later during a closed federal hearing to review their ongoing discrimination case. Alicia presented her findings, the leaked emails, the compliance harassment logs, the financial threats, and, finally, Laura's testimony. It wasn't dramatic. She spoke plainly, even haltingly, detailing how her neurological injury had been exacerbated by the taser, how she had been treated like a trespasser on her own land, and how every attempt to reclaim peace had been met with escalation. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She stated facts. When she finished, the room was silent. Not out of politeness, out of discomfort. The truth had a weight that couldn't be argued away. 2 days later, Ryan received the notice he had been waiting for. The Department of Housing and Urban Development had ruled in their favor. The council was found in violation of federal housing protections and anti-discrimination laws, and their actions were deemed retaliatory, malicious, and systemic. They were ordered to suspend all enforcement activities against the Millers, rescind all compliance claims, pay restitution for damages, and submit to a third-party audit of their governance procedures. But it wasn't over. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, Ryan noticed movement near the street. A familiar SUV pulled up, the same one used during the earliest rounds of field inspections. Out stepped Charles Benton, the polished special counsel who had once offered them a settlement wrapped in a velvet threat. This time, he didn't come to negotiate. "We'll be appealing," he said. "Your ruling won't stand. There are interests far beyond this neighborhood watching what happens here." Ryan didn't respond. He watched the man's expression, calm but too controlled, as if straining not to show something beneath the surface. "You should understand," Benton continued, "you've made enemies that don't show up in courtrooms." Ryan stepped forward, close enough that Benton had to shift his weight. "You should understand," he said quietly, "we're not afraid of people like you anymore." Benton left. No more threats were spoken, no deals offered, just the lingering sense of something unfinished. Inside the house, Laura was waiting. Ryan didn't need to tell her what had happened. She had seen the car. She only asked one question. "Are they done?" Ryan shook his head. "They're regrouping." She nodded, then stood, crossing to the front window. For the first time in weeks, she didn't close the curtains. Whatever came next, they would face it in the open. In the weeks that followed the ruling, a strange quiet settled over the neighborhood. Not peace, not reconciliation, but the brittle stillness that comes after a storm, where everything appears intact but nothing quite feels the same. Ryan and Laura continued their routines as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The flags and slogans that once decorated their neighbors' lawns slowly vanished, stripped away without fanfare. The monthly newsletters from the community board arrived thinner, increasingly vague in language, and the once frequent compliance checks stopped altogether. An administrative reshuffling was announced quietly. An internal audit had been ordered, several longtime members had resigned voluntarily, and a third-party oversight committee was being introduced under federal supervision. No one openly referenced the case, but the air was full of it, dense with the discomfort of those who had looked the other way for too long and now didn't know how to look back. Laura spent more time outside again. It started with small steps, watering her plants, organizing the shed, sweeping the porch, and then, gradually, she returned to walking the perimeter twice a day, her stride slower but certain. She spoke little of the trauma, not because she had forgotten it, but because it no longer owned her. It lived in her, of course, like a shadow cast in permanent afternoon light, but she had learned to walk beside it instead of under it. The garden she tended bloomed brighter than the one before. Her hands, still unsteady, moved with purpose. One afternoon, as she trimmed back a row of lavender, a neighbor approached, an older woman who had never spoken to Laura before but now stood nervously at the edge of the walkway, offering a hesitant hello. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't solidarity, but it was something. Laura returned the nod and went back to her work. That, too, was enough. Ryan remained vigilant. The victory had not made him naive. He understood that the legal ruling was only a surface correction, a pressure valve that released the worst of the visible steam but didn't dismantle the machine underneath. The people who had engineered this campaign, those who had funded it, sanctioned it, benefited from its silence, had not disappeared. They had simply gone quiet, recalibrating their methods, waiting for the next opportunity when no one would be watching as closely. But Ryan was watching. He maintained every log, every document, every encrypted backup. He invested in legal insurance. He upgraded the security system. And, most importantly, he stayed connected to the agencies, to the advocates, to the people who had stood beside them when no one else would. The legal settlement, while substantial, was never treated as a reward. Most of it went to rebuilding. Legal fees, property repairs, future protections. But Ryan and Laura set aside a portion, small but symbolic, to fund a new initiative, an advocacy program offering free legal consultations and documentation services to disabled veterans targeted by private property enforcement schemes. Alicia helped shape the charter. Within a month, 2 more families from a nearby township reached out for assistance. Their stories were different in detail but painfully similar in shape. Quiet pressure, procedural ambush, attempts to disappear them without consequence. This time, though, someone answered. The Millers had opened a door, and now it would not close. The final chapter didn't arrive with drama. There was no last standoff, no dramatic collapse of the council, no crowd of neighbors gathering to cheer in reconciliation. Instead, one morning, a new letter arrived in the mailbox. It was slim, printed on plain white paper, and bore a simple message. Notification of zoning update completion, with confirmation that all contested compliance issues had been dismissed and the property had been removed from internal monitoring. Ryan read it twice, then handed it to Laura without comment. She read it once, then placed it face down on the table and went to brew tea. They didn't celebrate. They didn't post about it or share the news with those who had never asked. Instead, that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, they sat together on the porch, the lights low, the air cool, and watched the quiet return not as surrender, but as reclamation. The wind moved softly through the trees. The garden hummed with the patient rhythm of late spring. Laura's hand rested on Ryan's knee, light and steady, and for the first time in a long time, they both felt the house breathe with them, whole again, not because the world outside had changed, but because they had refused to be pushed out of it.